Good morning, Mosaic. I said earlier in the service today that I wanted to talk about Sappho because I am a lesbian and a poet. These things are true, but it is not the entire reason. When I think about why I'm choosing to talk about Sappho today specifically, I think about the privilege that is an easily accessible history. I think about this old quote that I believe was attributed to Winston Churchill, that is, history is written by the victors. I posit that victor isn't the right word. Victor implies the existence of a fair fight. I think that often history is overwritten by oppressors, which is then edited and rewritten by the next people in power, regardless of truth or facts. I didn't always feel this way. I had the textbooks handed to me and memorized the facts in order to pass the tests. I'd have my mother saying, well, actually, they're omitting ABC, or XYZ is more of what happened. And my dad said I should just focus on what was in the books because the grade is what affected me immediately. It wasn't until after I graduated high school that I began to learn how heavily edited our history books were. I learned how the agendas that those in charge of curriculum have heavily affects the diluted truths that are filtered through to the page. And this made me want to take a closer look at what I had learned in the past about Sappho. I knew as I began to research into Sappho's life and legacy, what I'm reading is not necessarily what actually happened. To start with, the huge obstacle is the amount of time that's passed. Sappho existed thousands of years ago. If she had existed 20 years ago, I feel like it wouldn't be that hard to gather primary and secondary sources and easily learn what her life had been like and who she was. But with a gap of roughly 2,624 years, the documents are not as easily accessible. I had another more sinister idea to consider. Sometimes history is completely blotted out and rewritten. So we're left with those factors with which people assembled a quilted legacy, which could either be a filtered truth with meager facts or lies threaded with tiny bits of facts. So let's go ahead and start with the meager truth. What we know to be true given its undisputed references regardless of time and culture, even if the information is limited. Sappho is estimated to have been born around 620 BCE on the island of Lesbos in Greece. She was born into an aristocratic family. The exact location of her birth is unknown, but she is thought to have been born in either Erissos or Mytilene. Although the definite names of her parents are unknown, she reportedly had three brothers, Charaxos, Lyricos, and Eurygeos. I wasn't able to find any specific information on her education, but it's a reasonable assumption to make that it would be one deemed more than satisfactory for an aristocrat's daughter. We know that her grasp of language and poetic arts was superb because it was what she would go on to dedicate her life to. Sappho is known for her poetry, especially and specifically her lyric poetry. As the word lyric suggests, it's a style of poetry that was set to music. This is why depictions of her in art tend to have her either holding or near a lyre. A part of what made her poetry so powerful was its evocative first-person narrative. Prior to that time, it wasn't really written in first person. It was written from the perspective of the gods. This newer lens puts you right there with the passion, right there in the moment. The way she would describe love and yearning and pain, it was so raw, so real. Instead of saying, looking at you fills me with a feeling so intense that I feel I can't handle it, she said, as soon as I glance at you a moment, I can't say a thing, and my tongue stiffens into silence. Thin flames underneath my skin prickle and spark. A rush of blood booms in my ears, and then my eyes go dark, and sweat pours coldly over me, and all my body shakes, suddenly sallower than summer grass, and death, I fear and feel, is very near. I mean, that paints a picture. In my opinion, it paints a masterpiece. Beyond her groundbreaking use of first-person narrative, she was also renowned in her strides in further evolving technical aspects of poetry. She was even the namesake of a structure of poetry, Sapphic stanzas. Bear with me as I attempt to make this description make sense. The type of meter that Sapphic stanzas are built on is based off of the idea of long and short syllables that existed in ancient Greece, but then eventually evolved into a combination of stressed and unstressed syllables. This further broke down into trochees, which is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable, and dactyls, which is a stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables. Trochee and dactyl probably sound a bit confusing, but think of it as hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. Hickory and dickory in that first line are dactyls. You can hear it in the first syllable, hickory dickory. And then there's the trochees in the second line. It's like you put your foot on the gas a bit, but then you ease up back and forth. The mouse ran up the clock. And to bring it back to Sapphic stanzas with our new trochee and dactyl knowledge, the first 3 lines of a Sapphic stanza go trochee, trochee, dactyl, trochee, trochee. And then the 4th line is called an adonic and has a dactyl followed by a trochee. To show an example, let's read through a stanza of the Anactoria poem by Sappho. This version is translated by Richard Lattimore. Some there are who say that the fairest thing seen on the black earth is an array of horsemen. Some men marching. Some would say ships. But I say, she whom one loves best. To show the emphasis, I'll reread that first line. Some there are who say that the fairest thing seen. The rules around Sapphic stanzas would go on to become more and more flexible, but the iconic structure would continue to be attributed to Sappho. In total, it's estimated that she wrote about 10,000 lines of poetry. Much of it has been lost. There's a gathering of fragments that are attributed to her, but more is being found as time goes on, which is exciting. We know that she was exiled at some point for unknown reasons, the common theory being that it was political, and she spent time in Sicily before returning. Throughout her life and onward, she had a profound influence on society and art. Plato referred to her as the 10th Muse. She was seen as so influential and iconic as to be seen as equal to goddesses presiding over the concept of art. She was also referred to as the Poetess, which I feel is pretty self-explanatory. To be seen as the Poetess feels like such large shoes, but she fit them perfectly. So these are the facts that we know for sure. Now let's move on to the disputed aspects of who she is. There are some that believe that she had a child named Cleis. She has mentioned Cleis 2 times in her writing in ways that could be seen as familial, but are not necessarily familial. There is no evidence of her explicitly referring to her as her daughter, though, so it's still up to debate. The other thing that is up for debate is whether or not Sappho had a role of authority over a group of women in Lesbos, usually a school teacher or a priestess. There is no evidence that she was a priestess of Aphrodite, only that she wrote poems about her, which was a common topic of poetry. And she never talks about being a teacher or the head of school in her writing. The common thought by people that do not believe her to have these roles was that these were excuses to hide the actual context of the relationships that she had with women and to make her seem less queer. To follow this line of thought, let's move ahead to my least favorite part of the research that I did. It's the parts of her history that were rewritten. It is no surprise to those that have spent any amount of time around queerness in society that to exist while queer is seen as a political act. I, as a lesbian, am seen by society to have made a political statement when I say that not only am I a lesbian, but I'm going to reject the call to squash that part of myself and instead see it as a legitimate part of my identity. When a fundamental aspect of your personhood is seen by a chunk of the population as inherently shameful, to live without shame is seen as defiant of their interpretation, as defiant to their laws of reality. This aspect of queerness means that every person that has studied and written about Sappho runs the chance of interpreting her life through the lens of their opinion of queerness. This, I believe, is the source of why so much of Sappho's story is subject to rewriting. In the 10th century CE, a Byzantine encyclopedia called the Suda said that Sappho had apparently had a husband named Cercolas from the Isle of Andros. This was a full 1,500 years or so after her lifetime and was the first mention of her having a husband. This is now thought to be a joke that had been misunderstood by the people compiling information about her into the Suda, as the translation of Kirkolis sounds like it comes from Kirkos, the word for penis, and isn't actually a name ever reported to be used by anyone else. Also, Andros, while an island, is also a word for man. This is why there is a joke in circles that have an interest in queer history, and that is best said by Holt and Parker in his paper Sappho Schoolmistress. Sappho's husband's name is Dick Alcock from the Isle of Man. Definitely sounds like a real name of a real person. Also, side note, if you all are interested in reading more about Sappho, I highly recommend that paper specifically. I'm going to quote it again later, but I want you to know that if I quoted every part of that paper that I loved, I would just be reading the entire paper. The next rewriting of her story is the fact that the only account that I could find about how she died was that it was legend that she killed herself by throwing herself off of a cliff because of some ferryman named Theon not returning her feelings. I'm assuming this happened because, one, in Greek mythology, he is a character that is said to be from the same island that or same area that she lived in. And two, there are multiple Aphrodite legends that could be mixed up to make that story. One where Aphrodite gets a ride from him for free, and another one where Aphrodite throws herself off of the same cliffs as Sappho for reportedly the same reason, which is wanting to be rid of love due to the heartbreak. I'm guessing that you all have noticed the link between these misstellings of her life. They all make her seem less queer. Here is why I think this happened. People wanted to be able to enjoy her writing without the association of queerness. If they could find some loose evidence that she wasn't queer, it would be okay to like her writing and continue to celebrate her as the icon that she is. So her close relationships with women became her being a school teacher or a headmistress. Her knowing a young child became her having a daughter. A misinterpreted joke is evidence that she had a husband. A mishmash of legends about Aphrodite became a tragic tale of Sappho loving a man who didn't return her affections, leading to her suicide. People looked at very few fragments of her writing and paid attention to the ones that supported their opinion of who she was as a person. They took the fragments out of context and created a Sappho they happened to find palatable. And when there was commentary that supported these ideas, this is what was carried forth as a valid source in history, even when there wasn't actually any evidence in this commentary. Suddenly, her queerness was not an aspect of her, but it's what people had written about her in order to besmirch her name. To go back to the paper Sappho Schoolmistress by Holt and Parker, he says a great deal that I agree with when it comes to the way that people have wrongly approached the history and writing of Sappho. I particularly like the part where he says this. Perhaps an even better image for Sappho than the blank page is the palimpsest. There does exist a text of Sappho, but it is so thickly written over with critical accumulation that it is almost impossible to make out the words beneath. This repetition of statements and assumptions from book to book is indicative of what seems to me to be a widespread tendency in the study of Sappho, where statements are taken from previous works without any critical evaluation, frequently without citation, as if they were facts so basic that everyone knows them. Further, this lack of critical evaluation towards Sappho stands in sharp context to the general skeptical approach to the other lyric poets. For example, Alcaeus. Specifically, there is a failure to try as far as possible to look at the text without first reading the commentary. I think it was a combination of gross oversight and malicious narrative shaping that has made Sappho's story into what it is now. I also think that it's insidious. It's so easy to look at a story like this and think, well, yeah, people made mistakes, but that's what happens. It was so long ago. Of course, there's going to be places where people dispute. Who knows who she was with, who she loved? And does it even really matter in the grand scheme of things? She was a great writer. Why make it about anything else? To that voice I say, because queer history matters. We will never know how many great history makers were queer. For the majority of human history, it was dangerous to be openly queer, even deadly. They had to hide and burn their letters and love out of sight. So many of our stories will never be told. We cannot afford to lose any ground. When I think of where we head as a country with the new presidency, I feel fear. I know you probably didn't expect a sermon this upset when you were hearing that I was going to talk about Sappho. And I apologize for that. But I cannot overemphasize how important it is that we continue to share queer history. The young queer people of today need to know that as long as humans have existed, queer people have existed. They wrote poetry and sang and loved and lived. We existed and will continue to do so. Even in the darkest times, the community has stood together and kept marching. We will live. We will write. And we will tell our stories. Thank you for having me. Blessed be.